Hi, this is Huxley and welcome to my very girly studio in Berkhamsted, and I'm going to take you through my track, I Want You.
I want you. You ain't gotta wonder. I can bring the summer on you. You can hold me, baby. Ain't no ifs or maybes. I want you.
Okay, so when I first started this track, it was actually, I probably made this one first out of the whole album, and I was starting to think about reintroducing proper melodies and turning it into a proper song again. So I was listening to a lot of Book of Shade and kind of electro-chemy and stuff, and I was trying to get away from the way I worked on the EPs that I previously released, where I just kind of went straight to a sample or started with a beat or whatever. So actually, when I first started, the first thing I started doing was kind of just noodling around on the Omnisphere synth. And I'm not the best keys player in the world, and if you ask me to play this again, I might not even be able to do it now. But it's just, I kind of recorded that in, and I thought what I wanted to do around it. It actually sat as an instrumental for a long time before Rose's Gabor Kona came in and did the vocal on it. But I just talk about kind of what I've done to each part. So, like I said, this is not how I start. How I would normally start would just be to kind of get a loop going of 8 bars and just keep looping it. The track was just this for a long time while I was trying to get everything perfect. As you can tell, there really isn't that much to this track, really. What I've kind of tried to do is change everything by automating a lot of stuff. So even just the ARP here. See, I'm trying to add a bit of tremolo to it there. It's just kind of trying to add a bit more depth to the sounds rather than adding more things in, which is what I've done in the past to kind of make things fuller, but I've realised actually that's probably the worst way to do it because it just becomes messy. Again, the low note, the reason I put it on here is because there's a slightly different EQ and effects on there, as you'll be able to see. I wanted that one a bit more prominent, and this one kind of a bit more dreamy or whatever. So I use these a lot. The Lipscomb Reverbs, I think they're probably on every channel, pretty much, music-wise anyway. I just think they're really good. I mean, here it says vocal, but I've kind of just, this is the preset thing, and then I go in and make my own. Obviously, I don't want the reverb to be too high, so I've brought it down a lot. When I start a track, I have an auto load that always has the same buses set up just to start with, and then I mess around with them. But this is one that I always use. The drum plate on the short thing here, I don't know. I mean, I've always used it. Maybe it's a bad habit to be getting into, but I think that, you know, if I just mute these, it just adds an instant kind of short bit of depth to the hat, which actually is a very kind of thin hi-hat anyway. Let me just see, I mean, that kind of sounds very lifeless, whereas you put it on and it instantly adds something to it. This is just, that's just kind of an automated Echo Boy, which again, these sound toys are great for that kind of thing. The processing on the kick is very basic, just a bit of EQ, rolled everything off around 40, giving it a tiny bit of a bump, and then compressed it. For a kick, I always dip around 200 hertz, around that thing, because I feel it takes a bit of a frequency out that can clash with other things working like from the mid to the low, and I just feel it adds a bit nice. Again, compression-wise, I've just used the Logic ones in here. This was made actually quite a long time ago, so now I'd maybe use the Waves, but I still think these are really, really good. Very small attack, kind of very small ratio and just bring it down and kind of tell it kind of pumps a little bit. And this is kind of what makes this sound is kind of what makes the beat interesting, in my opinion, because without it, it's just kind of a very standard kind of, which is, I mean, the most simple beat I've ever done, probably. Again, all the hi-hats and everything, tiny bit of compression, a little bit of EQ. And then, so to make the beat a bit more interesting and a bit more like the kind of vibe I was going for, all I've done is taken a hi-hat from Albino. And this is something I used to do a long time ago when I used to like to think I could make minimal house, but was never really that good at it. And then all I've done is automate how it sounds in terms of the cut-off. And it, again, adds a bit kind of, it adds an interesting layer for me anyway, that kind of I think moves the track along quite nicely. My own cat-handed way of doing a sidechain is basically I have this going to the bus. On these ones it's so easy, so for sidechaining I always use the Logic compressors and just have another Ultra Beat open with a standard kick on it, and then just run that into a bus and mute the bus basically, and then it kind of works almost instantly. And I have this always on the auto load below, just so, I mean, I know I'm going to sidechain something. Normally I'd sidechain the bass because it then can give the kick and the bass a bit more space for each other. And so the bass basically is another Spectrasonics plugin. I would suggest anyone to get this if they kind of want bass sounds that sound like great imitations of other things. As you see, this is originally the classic TB303 square sound, so maybe not as acidy, just a... And all I've done throughout the track is... So here I've got it very straight, and I'm just playing a bit with the cut-off, mainly towards the end of the track, as you can see. But to get the wobble, which is kind of what... I mean, for any of my tracks, if you've listened to any of them, they all have quite prominent bass lines. It's kind of what I use to move along a track, maybe more than melody, especially at this time when I was still kind of getting back into the whole song aspect of things. So all I've literally done here, as you can see from the automation, if I make that a bit bigger, is when it's running in to the verse, I've just automated the LFO up. If I find the right one. I think it's this one. Literally just messed around with the depth. It gives the bass just more of a pumping feel. It kind of feels like the track drops, even though it's obviously not that kind of record. And along with the kind of dreamy texture of the arps and stuff, I think it adds a nice bit of rawness to the track, which I think without it, again, it could probably just sound a little bit kind of a bit too dreamy for my taste. Yeah. And the way that the bass kind of bends, so if you just overlap them a little bit and then again go on to the glide function, which is kind of what gives it the 303 that classic sound. So without it, it would just sound... I mean, it would sound completely different in my opinion. It would take away from what the whole point of it is. And it can't, again, that I think that works quite nicely with the way that the original art works as well. If you listen, I think with to get a lot of nice warmth, instant kind of warmth to the bass, I use this, which is the Sound Toys Decapitator. It's literally just a little bit of distortion, basically, But I think if you want to get the analog feel, it's quite a good place to start. You can take the tone down a little bit. So that's without it, that's with it, and then it just adds real kind of rugged kind of sound to it. Because this sound is quite clean sounding, I haven't wanted to push it, but you can really get some interesting kind of sounds out of it. That was something. In fact, the sound toys are definitely something I would suggest if you want to kind of make analogy kind of music and don't maybe have the money for analog. Getting something like that, and even just the Lipscomb Reverbs, a perfect kind of add a lot of warmth to stuff. That's what I've always used. A lot of people have asked me if I used a lot of hardware for years, and it's only really in the new stuff that hasn't even come out yet. It's when I've started using everything. The next main bit was just this. Again, I wanted to be a bit more dreamy. So, again, use a trillion. As you can see, I use a lot of this kind of same stuff, but I think it's more important to know how to use things well and kind of get to know each plugin rather than just get loads of stuff in there that you not really know how to use. It's fun to play around with, but I think that get to know whatever you like. You might not like Trillion, you might like whatever, some of the Arturia stuff, but for me, these sound the best, and they sound fat, and they just sound nice. So this is just a synth from there, preset. Probably messed around with it. I can't completely remember what I've done to this, to be honest. It was so long ago. But again, added quite a big reverb to this to kind of give it that washed out kind of feel. Just a standard delay on it, Logic delay. Again, the Sound Toys ones are probably better than this, in fairness, but this, for what I wanted, it just adds a nice. I just like the ease of use in terms of between the high and low cut and the feedback, and you kind of know where it starts to clip and all that kind of stuff. So for me, it's just perfect. And then just basic EQ. I try and most of the time I try and keep the channel strips kind of. I'd rather put less on it and work on the sound in the synth, just because sometimes if you have too much processing going on, my computer can't always handle it, to be honest with you, and I don't always like working with audio, so I don't like to bounce things, because if I want to go and filter something, again, it's not the best for me. Everything here, actually, although I couldn't play it again, everything I've done here is played by me. I kind of always, in most of my tracks, I always, at the time I'm playing it and it's fine and I can play it, I've kind of taught myself a little bit. It's just going back to it. So the bass line I've played in, this thing I've played in, when we get onto the strings, I mean, it's fairly standard stuff, strings really, but yeah, I always play stuff in. I always quantize things because I'm not that great a player, but I think that playing it in gives it a bit more of a natural feel, and you can tell when someone's just drawn it in. Plus, I don't think for me, I can't get any kind of vibe going. If I'm sat there kind of just with a box, kind of putting stuff in, I have no idea what it's going to sound like. I mean, sometimes that can be interesting, but I just can't. For me, I have no vibe when I'm making something if I work like that. I know a lot of people do, so fair enough, but it's just not for me. And then the strings, which is literally the last bit of the last kind of element to the music, really, because these things actually don't exist. Logic preset strings. They're not the best strings by any stretch of the imagination. They sound a bit plasticky, but I think if you, again, add a nice Lipscomb reverb to it, EQ it a little bit. When I'm working with this kind of sound, I think that it's good to spend a lot of time EQing it. So I probably spent a good few hours just EQing that off as well. Might not be able to even hear much difference on these monitors. for me, it's a lot different in my own head, and then obviously with the reverb as well. And that was kind of sat like this for a long time. Basically, what happened was the vocal. Like I said, it was probably the first track I wrote on the album, and I wasn't sure it was going to have a vocal. Originally, it had this kind of big, horrible synth thing that came in and was going to be the major aspect of it, but scrapped that because it wasn't very good. And it was more arranged, maybe, I mean, not massively different to this. It was quite a lot longer originally, and it probably was a bit more geared toward the dance floor. But then this track doesn't really work in that sense, I don't think, unless you're kind of playing it as an end-of-night record. So I sat down and thought, listened to some tracks and thought, okay, so it needs to be verse, chorus, but still I want it to be kind of interesting in the way things come in, e.g. all the filtering on the strings and stuff. And it sat there for probably 8 months before anything happened with it, because I originally wrote one album, completely scrapped that apart from this and one other track, and came back to it. And then I can't remember how we got hooked up. I can't remember if I think I probably contacted her. But anyway, I sent this over to Roses Gabor, and she sat down and demoed it, basically. And that's whose voice you can hear on it. Just mute these.
I want you. You ain't gotta wonder. I can bring the summer on you.
So her voice is, when there's just 3 layers. We recorded it somewhere that wasn't that great, so unfortunately there's quite a lot of bleed on it. But I think her voice is so kind of, I didn't want to add any more harmonies or anything. I thought one main layer and a bottom one was perfect. They're just the same thing doubled. But when it came to kind of processing the vocal, whereas I normally, as I said before, I don't really put that much stuff on it, I found the opposite had to be done for these, because we didn't record it in the best studio, and there is a lot of bleed from the original track, unfortunately. So it took quite a while to kind of get them how I wanted them to be. Like I do with all the vocals, I bus the main ones to one bus. And normally normally don't really affect these, but on this actually I have. Again, there's quite a lot of automation on here. I've kind of brought this one up just to show you what's on there. So this is automating to the bus, and on each bus there is a separate effect. So this one is just for the reverb, and I believe this one is just delay. Yeah, it's just got an echo boy. For the automation with her, I've definitely drawn that in. But when it came to the automation on the strings, I don't actually have it set up anymore. But I've got one of the Korg things. I guess obviously I can do it to one of these knobs now, and just draw it in and, like you say, vibe off when you're recording it. Again with the playing thing, kind of going in a similar way. Although I've cleaned it up there because obviously I've messed it up, I feel you get a bit more of a vibe going, and you feel it. I mean, as like shit as it sounds or whatever, you get a bit more of a vibe. You get into it, and music. I used to think of it not as a clinical thing, but used to be quite detached from when I made music. But now, I think the more you do, and the more work you put in yourself without drawing in and stopping, I think the more kind of immersed in the track you become. Although I've obviously once the vocal's been in, you have to kind of make everything fit a bit more. So these strings actually were a bit more kind of harsh originally, and probably a bit bigger and a bit louder. But you need to be able to hear her because she's, in my opinion, the best bit of the track now. And then yeah, just the ad-libs again, just like I said before, so here's a good example. I've actually done nothing on the channel and then just done everything, all the processing on the one bus. These were actually done as full stems when we recorded them, But because there was so much bleed, we've just cut them off. And instead of gating them, it was a bit nicer to just do the stuff ourselves, because the gate just didn't. I mean, it just didn't work as well. In terms of the ad libs, again, we've just gone through her ad libs and cut out the best ones, and kind of tried to make them all work together. The thing about her is she gave us loads and loads of great ad libs, but a lot of them didn't kind of work with each other in terms of where she wanted to place them and stuff. So I took everything out. I would say actually the vocal processing probably took me longer than it did getting the whole idea of the track, making her vocal work how I wanted to, and getting the ad libs that I wanted to get in. Whole process probably took longer than kind of writing the original riff. Yeah, I think I didn't know the tone of her voice was very different to what I was used to, because she has got such a kind of unique voice, especially with the low notes added in. I found the low were clashing with the bass sometimes in a really nice way, but for this kind of track didn't actually work that well. And the ad libs, just I wanted them to sound the best they could. As you can see, I've cut the hell out of most of these, and there's a lot of automation, especially on the last one, where I've just kind of done a nice bit of panning on that or whatever, just to kind of just. Because I really wanted this one in there, but for some reason it for a long time wasn't sitting how I wanted to. But I felt a bit of padding, just kind of, it did the trick for some reason. Again with the low bit here. A bit of a dodgy cut there, but it kind of, when you have the track behind it, it kind of works nicely. So I think that the main trouble for me was, when I was writing this, was to think of it as a song on an album and not a track that I wanted to like hammer out when I'm playing. And so one of the most difficult things was the arrangement. Like I say, it took me a long time to get what I wanted in terms of how the track came in and worked around the vocal. And I'm happy with it now, but it was definitely a long process, that's for sure. This was one of the first tracks I did away from incorporating samples in any sense, even if that was a sampled key or anything. So kind of, I guess that was another reason why maybe the arrangement took me quite a while, because I wasn't bouncing off one sample, and I wasn't going from as the beat is quite basic, I wasn't driving energy just from the beat. I was kind of trying to get it from automating the bass and automating the strings and kind of bringing the keys in a bit differently. Getting into a workflow using hardware is quite hard when you've just come from using in the box, and that's something, especially at this time. I think I had a micro Korg at the time, which is now dead. Even thinking to turn around and play on it and record it in was not something I was used to, but now I'm preferring making music. I think I've gone from this, when I started doing the album and I wanted to be a bit more immersed in the track, I've gone from this kind of way and then now kind of messing around on equipment and pressing buttons and all this kind of stuff. I do kind of try and mix things as I'm making things, because I like to hear things as they're going to finally come out. I find it hard to write a track and then go back and mix everything, although obviously you have to do it a little bit. In terms of kick and bass, in this track I've got them as the kick as very much just a knocky sound, very short, pumping around kind of the 50, 60 hertz kind of thing. And then because the bass is quite melodic, I've pumped that up a bit higher so you can hear it a bit more as a melody, rather than just a sub rolling along below it. And it's just and it's a lot more drone in. It's got its own space. And in terms of good idea, like I said, is to sidechain the bass to the kick, because then you instantly take away a lot of the clashing anyway, in my experience. So as you can tell, kind of this is kicking around about 100 hertz really, and then that's very constant, about 50, 60. I think that getting the bass, the kick and the bass line working together is almost the most important thing when it comes to this kind of music, like I say, because it gives it its rhythm, it gives it its whole backbone. It's probably true with most kind of music, it's just I don't make that stuff. And then also, if you get that right, it in terms of mix for me, it ultimately gives you a fat layer to work with and just sounds better, and then you can add what you need to add on top of it. Other mixing things, I mean, it's just basic stuff. Never try and make sure everything has its own frequencies. Normally, with the hi-hats, I run off some of the top, really high top end, because the tinniness doesn't work well for me. And plus, I think it makes the sound sound a bit more natural. And that's about it, mixing-wise, really. I kind of take everything as it comes. In this track, obviously, I had the vocal, which is the lead thing. So if anything, everything had to work with all the melodic parts. Had to kind of make sure that they weren't in the way of where the vocal was sitting, which I guess is another great thing to do. Great thing to get right. If you look at the ARP as well. Just trying to give the vocal enough space, taking things away. Yeah, just taking things away that clash from the vocal. The vocal's it's only 2 layers, so there's not much to it, but because it's quite different in terms of, if you hear her vocal here, the very low kind of thing. So that was maybe a bit of a struggle when it came to actually mixing that with the rest of the music, but it adds such a nice layer to it. The master, in fact what I was going to say was, I've never had a professional kind of lesson in terms of producing. I've always just gone by my own ear and learnt my own things. So maybe the technical side of things sometimes aren't the best, but I think this way also kind of gives you a more natural feeling to how you mix the music. In terms of the master, because I have processed everything so highly and I've EQ'd everything on its own channel, and this is something that I always do actually, I don't really like touching the master. I mean, there's a PSP and a limiter on there just so I can whack it out when I'm making things, although the PSP was probably something I tried and then didn't like, so bypassed it. I think that if you mix everything well enough on the stems and everything, you don't need to add that much to the master. And I find that it also gives a mastering engineer, so much more space to play with if you haven't overly compressed anything or limited the whole track or whatever. And that's a really simple thing. I have a multimeter on there just so I can see what everything's kicking and making sure that the little bit of bass at the bottom I don't like, and everything's kind of quite well rounded. But apart from that, it's very simple really. I think spend the time EQing the kicks and the basses, and it kind of does it itself. You don't need to add all these instant kind of gratification things, if you know what I'm talking about.